Here is Noodler's Polar Purple, a purple ink. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. Another aggressive ink in the Polar line of inks, and at least this is the last I will ever do of them. Now, using this ink, really, it all happened because there was a viewer that was really interested in the reviews of these inks, and I played with them some long before the reviews and was incredibly not looking forward to doing it. Now, even worse with this ink is it's an uninteresting purple to look at. I don't want to bash this too much in this part, so I have to kind of stop there. The pen for today is a Pelikan M120 with a fine nib. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. As a purple, we're getting a really flat and uninteresting purple on this Clairfontaine paper. Now, it's not feathering and it's not spreading. It does have some minor moments of shading. Maybe if you're really looking at it, you can kind of see in the word messengers on the third line where it looks as if the first and second E are slightly lighter than the rest of the word, but really what we have is generally a flat, uniform tone with no shading. Looking at the back of the page, between the wiggling fingers, we see this ink gets very deep into the paper. Now, it did not bleed through touching the page underneath, but it might, depending on the pen you're using, hinder your ability to write on the back of Clairfontaine paper. Very rare problem. Let's take a look at some other inks from the same manufacturer. Here is Noodler's Polar Black. Here is Noodler's Polar Brown. Here is Noodler's Polar Blue. Here is Noodler's Polar Brown. The next writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter's Notebook. We get a tone that is even flatter and less interesting than it was on the Clairfontaine. It is slightly lighter as a tone. Now, it's not feathering and it's not spreading, which is really good, considering I know this is an aggressive ink. We do see a moment of tone variation of some shading. When we look at Resolved and Dominion, second and third line, Resolved is quite a bit darker than Dominion, or specifically, we could say Dominion is quite a bit lighter than all of the other words around. Looking at the back of the page, between the wiggling fingers, we see this is a very aggressive ink getting deep into the page. It did spot the page underneath just a little bit, so it did bleed through, showing how aggressive it is and why I have the surprise that it didn't feather. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook. We get no kind of tone variation for being on this toned page. It is the same color that we had on the Clairfontaine. Now, it's not feathering and it's not spreading. It's not shading at all. It's also just not interesting to look at. Looking at the back of the page, this paper generally handles fountain pens fairly well. Look at how aggressive this ink is. You could almost see all of it through the page. It did spot the page underneath, bleeding through some, and the ghosting is more than a little bit, we'll say. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook. Here we get the same tone that we had on the Clairfontaine. Now, it stands out against the quad rule without any kind of problem, which is nice. It doesn't feather and it doesn't spread, which is nice. It doesn't shade, which is perfectly fine considering what the ink is, but wait till you see the back. Looking at the back of the page, you see this ink is very aggressive to this Rhodia paper, as it really did bleed heavily into the paper. Now, it did not touch the page underneath. There's a lot of ghosting going on. Really kind of alarming considering it did the same thing on Clairfontaine. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables.
Here is Noodler's Concord Bream. Here is Noodler's Concord Grape. Here is Noodler's American Aristocracy. Here is Noodler's Purple Mountain Majesties.
The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook. We get a lighter, flatter tone than we had on the Clairfontaine. We're not getting any feathering or spread or shading, and I can say that, as long as things hold up, I guess this would be a good ink for this paper, considering how resistant it is. Looking at the back of the page, between the wiggling fingers, you see how aggressive and deep into the paper this is. Not very common for this paper that an ink gets so deep in. Now, it did not bleed through touching the page underneath, but I don't know about taking notes back here. I wouldn't do it. While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to see ink to complement the color on the page.
Here is Noodler's Grown Cactus. Here is Organic Studios Arsenic Gray.
Here is Sailor Studio 130.
Here is Kayono Oto Yamabuki Iro.
The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. We have the same tone that we had on the Clairfontaine. Now, the feathering is incredibly minimal that's going on, though it does have some spread, and it does show a little bit of shading, more from word to word. But if you take a look at mountains on the third line, the M is darker than the O, and where it lightened up, the O, or the UNT, got dark again. The A lightened up a little bit. INS, darker again at the end. Don't normally get a lot of shading on this paper, and this ink has given almost none to this point. Looking at the back of the page, between the wiggling fingers, we see this is a very aggressive, deep into the paper type of ink. Oddly, it didn't touch the page underneath, but there is no writing on the back of the page with this. So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink? The wet fine of the Pelikan M120 shows only the worst that this ink really has to offer. I don't think it will really work well with anything but a dry fine pen. I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching. I want to let you know that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you heard of something if you go to buy.